Greetings and welcome to the Power of Word author panel. Yay! It is Sunday. Thank you for joining us. My name is Theresa Davis. I am the literary director for the ArtsXchange. And you are at the Power of Words author panel when poetry meets freedom songs and images, except this is a part of the series, but there will be no poetry spoken today, only the poetry of learning more about the world that we live in. Kumbaya. And now I have to say my thing. Funding for the ArtsXchange programs are provided by the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta through the Metropolitan Atlanta Arts Fund and the Fulton County Arts and Culture under the direction of the Fulton County Board of Commissioners. Additional program funding is provided by the Georgia Humanities and the Georgia Council for the Arts. And we would like to thank you so much for being here for this particular program. Today, I am having the power of words with Professor Natsu Taylor Saito, who teaches at Georgia State. And I am going to read a bio now. It's going to be amazing. You're going to be riveted. And I'm excited to have you. Hey.
Hey.
So Professor Natsu Taylor Saito, JD, Regents, Professor and Professor of Law, Center for Access to Justice, College of Law, Georgia State University, will provide a historical perspective and legal analysis after receiving Juris Doctorate, right? Mm-hmm. That's what JD stands for. I knew that. From Yale Law School in 1987, she taught as an adjunct at Emory University School of Law before joining the Georgia State Law Facility. Professor Saito teaches public international law and international human rights, race, ethnicity, and the law. Currently a faculty affiliate of the Center for Access to Justice, as well as the Department of African American Studies. She joined the College of Law faculty in 1994 and became a distinguished university professor in 2016. You've always been distinguished in my heart. I'm just going to say that out loud right now. In 2021, she was appointed a Regents professor. Professor Saito is the author of 3 books and about 50 articles of book chapters. Her latest book is Colonialism, Race, and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists. She has served as an advisor to the Asian American Law Student Association, the Latinx and Caribbean Law Student Association, and Immigrant Law Society and Student Chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. Welcome, Professor Saito. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to ask just a couple of questions just to get us started. Light stuff, just so we could like reconnect. I know 2020 changed a lot of things for a lot of people. How have you maintained your levity, your happiness, your joy? What has brought you joy in the last 2 years that you didn't think you needed to bring you joy?
Good question. Walking almost every day, which I used to think was a good idea, but almost never did. And I found out that it actually brings joy. Cooking, which I liked, but I didn't do nearly as regularly. Feeding birds. Okay. Do these all count? Reading novels. I mean, I always knew I liked to read novels, but I never felt like I had time before. So.
Yeah, I think that this time, I think 2020 taught us that, hey, wait, we do have time to do other things. And I feel like that disconnect, even as abrupt and weird as it was, I think it changed the way people think about time and how time is spent. And is time even real?
Mm-hmm. That's a great.
I know working with students, like I work with a lot of young people, and during this time of changing trajectory, a lot of them learn that they thrive better when they're not in that environment of constant something. So some young people were really thriving. Some were, of course, regressing, but I think that was an opportunity for us to figure out what the balance was. Did you notice any of those changes in the college student lifestyle?
Yes, definitely. I think it's everything you said is true for them too, and true for us, right? Like all of a sudden you realize, oh, these things that I've been doing because I thought they were part of my identity or my life or my job or whatever, they didn't really need to happen. And, you know, I'm okay not going to some meetings, and I'm okay without, all sorts of, travel that I thought indispensable to my life. Really, it's okay without it. And the other thing about the pandemic, I think I'm a little sad because I feel like we haven't taken the advantage of it, but it really let us see so much of what we could do, right? It let us see that, who's an essential worker and who's not. It let us see that we don't really have to keep all those people locked up, and we don't really have to evict all those people from their housing and all kinds of things. Everybody really could get health care. All kinds of new possibilities were opened up. And like I said, I feel like we've let a lot of opportunities slip, but at least we saw that,
Yeah.
there's a whole nother way of doing this that's possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as far as being a lawyer, when you were younger, is this something that you thought you wanted to do when you grew up?
No, never. I never intended to be a lawyer.
Why is that?
Who wants to be a lawyer? Um, so when I was a kid, I used to argue a lot, apparently, and I do remember my parents telling me that I might grow up to be a lawyer. Um, but mostly I thought, I went to law school at a time when I was involved in a lot of political activity, and there were a lot of people getting locked up, and we didn't have enough lawyers. And, I knew from my experiences with those struggles that I wouldn't be good in court. Like it was just too frustrating, but that I could gain skills that would help in those, defending political activists and stuff. And so my plan was just to go part-time to law school and keep my regular teaching job and, just do a little support work on the side. But, things don't always turn out that way.
Yeah, tell me about it. I mean, I avoided being a poet like the plague because my mom and my dad were poets. I was like, I'm not going to be the apple that falls. I'm going to fall far from the tree. And no, that's not what happened at all. So I think sometimes in the back of our heads we kind of know. I knew I wanted to be when I was younger. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to tell the story. So I think in a weird way, I kind of set myself up to be where I am. Because I still feel like I am a truth teller. I just do it in a different way. So I'm not like getting fired from a news job, but I get to tell my
Yes.
truth in a way that that makes sense to me, and hopefully opens the door and provides conversation. And I feel like what you've done in your book is created those spaces to have conversations, and these are harder conversations. About things that people really don't want to talk about now, especially as we move into this climate of awareness and awakening, supposedly, but we're so awake that we don't want people to know part of the history because it could be embarrassing for people who perpetrated that, but not the people who received it. So it's very interesting, and I, as I was reading through some of the passages in your book, I was wondering, like, will have you gotten any blowback from the topics in your book? Have you gotten any like?
A little bit, but not real head on.
Yeah.
Just mostly from people who don't want to be identified as settlers and therefore are saying things like, well, you need to make more distinctions between blah, 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 and people's intent and whatever. So, people who want to be able to read it and not feel any sense of actual responsibility, I think.
Yeah.
But actually surprisingly little, which probably just means that nobody has read it. But
I know I have that. Yeah. I've had conversations with people about my book, and they'll ask a question, and you try not to show your whole face, and your head kind of tilts. You like, you didn't actually read the book, did you? So I'm gonna let you just lead with the question, because if you actually read it, you would not have asked me that question, or you would have not said that thing to me. So I think that, it is interesting how easy some people are to like comment on things when they've like basically read the title and maybe a chapter, and it's like now they know. Um, but
I also think that when we say things that need to be said, they make people uncomfortable, and so that's actually sometimes making people uncomfortable is a good litmus test, I think.
Yeah. Now, how long did it take you to research this book?
Oh, 10 years.
Wow.
I mean, I did other stuff in that time, right? But
yeah.
But yeah, I actually got a contract for it in 2010, and I was very late.
I mean, it's a dense topic, and I always wonder about process, about how one goes about, I'm gonna write this book about this thing, and then what the timeline is and how you space your time. So I've talked to authors who like develop their characters, and they have sticky notes all over the walls, and they create this timeline, and how long it takes them to actually connect all those stories. So that 10-year timeline that you're talking about, did you schedule like, okay, it is Monday, I'm going to work on this book for 3 hours, and then I'm going to go have lunch and go to the spa, clear my head, and then I'll come back and maybe read what I wrote. And then, so how did you structure yourself around, even though it was late, no judgment, how did you structure your time around creating this work?
Perhaps this is why it was so late, but I didn't particularly structure my time except to try to take any time I had available to work on it. So, just whenever I had, I tend to work better in big blocks. So like if I can, work for 10 hours a day, I can really focus and get it in, and then maybe not do anything for a couple of days.
Right.
But I don't do well when I have to sort of jump back and forth. Until I got to the last 2 months, when I thought I still had 6 months left, and they said, nope, you have to get it in within 2 months. At which point I got a calendar out and I said, these 4 days are chapter 3. The next 4 days are chapter 4, and this will get finished.
Yeah, I tend to focus snap harder when somebody says, yeah, your deadline is actually coming up, and then it's like take everything and just like swipe everything off the table, and then we're just gonna get it done, and then we're gonna act like we had it. That thing been done, Right. But no, I appreciate the work, and I appreciate the dedication. So at this point, I would like for you to share some parts of your book here, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, and Why Structural Racism Persists. And what I would like to invite those of you watching us in the world of Facebook or the use of tubes is, if you have any questions, comments, or anything that you would like to know more of or more about, please put them in the chat, and I will be able to ask Professor Saito those questions in between readings or after the reading. Okay. So right now we're going to hear some parts of this book.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd start just with the introduction, which starts with a quote from law professor Dorothy Roberts, who says, "How do we rectify a system that so brilliantly serves its intended purpose?" And that's really how I looked at this job, right? To try to figure out how we solve the problems that are really built into the system on purpose. So this is how I start. Racialization has always been essential to the establishment and maintenance of structures of power and privilege in the United States. Racial realism, as the late Derek Bell termed it, forces us to acknowledge that communities of color in the United States remain economically, politically, and socially subordinated long after the formal abolition of American apartheid. An honest assessment of these realities makes it clear that neither the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection nor the Nation of Immigrants mantra can effectively dislodge structural racism. Yet we continue to return to the courts, the legislatures, and our political leaders in these terms, seeming collectively at a loss for meaningful alternatives. The 2008 election of Barack Obama, the country's first Black president, generated a wide range of public reaction. It gave those contesting racialized subordination renewed hope for meaningful structural change. Those generally content with the status quo hailed it as evidence that the United States was already a post-racial society. And for those clinging to the perceived benefits of white supremacy, it signaled the crumbling of their world. The visuals shifted during the Obama era, but ultimately very little changed with respect to racial disparities in the distribution of power and wealth. Since the beginning of 2017, President Donald Trump's administration has illustrated how quickly and easily the perceived gains of subordinated groups can be reversed by executive action. Within just a few weeks of taking office, he expedited approval of oil pipelines contested by indigenous peoples, intensified immigration enforcement, and approved a travel ban targeting persons from predominantly Muslim countries, undercut enforcement of healthcare legislation, and appointed an attorney general who, despite the mass incarceration crisis, ordered federal prosecutors to seek the toughest charges and harshest sentences possible, even for persons accused of nonviolent drug offenses. Of equal significance, Trump's call to make America great again, with its thinly veiled racial overtones, clearly resonates with a large sector of the population. Trump is not being divisive so much as exposing some of the deepest schisms that permeate this society. The vision of America as a white supremacist, patriarchal, settler society is alive and well today. Ignoring this reality is no longer an option. We all have visions of better worlds, ones we'd like for ourselves or to bequeath to our children and their children. To build these futures, we need to understand what's wrong with where we are and how it got to be wrong. Tracing the problem to its source allows us to conceive structural rather than superficial solutions. Michel Foucault articulated this in terms of historical genealogy, but it doesn't take a French philosopher to make this point. Analogizing political struggle to a journey across the northern plains, Lakota elder Matthew King observed that it's necessary to look back over your shoulder periodically because, quote, to know how to get to where you want to go, you have to first know where you are. And to know where you are, you always have to know where you've been. This process requires conceptual frameworks unconstrained by the consensus reality reflected in the master narrative of American history. For we know it to be a narrative that does not accurately reflect the realities of life for most people of color, or indeed most white people in this country. Tracing our histories back to locate the origins of racialized subordination leads us inevitably to the colonization of this continent by Euro-American settlers, to their determined attempts to eliminate indigenous peoples of this land, and to the various strategies the settlers have employed and continue to use to profit from occupied lands. That genealogy and what it can tell us about deconstructing racial privilege and subjugation is the focus of this book. I found that discussing race as a function of colonialism meets with considerable resistance from those who contest the status quo, as well as those who support it, from non-Indigenous people of color and from those who identify as white. This may be because most struggles for racial justice focus almost exclusively on the enforcement of rights and the expansion of opportunities within extant state structures. For those of us engaged in such efforts, the suggestion that we might be trying to obtain our fair share of lands and opportunities built on the shifting sands of genocide and continuing colonial occupation is virtually unthinkable. As a result, discussions of indigenous sovereignty are generally cabined in their own discursive sphere, while broader discussions of racism tend to include American Indians as, at best, simply another minority in the requisite list of racial food groups. The relationship between indigenous rights and the subordination of other people of color is only occasionally confronted. It's the elephant in the room, or perhaps still waiting in the hall, a subject few non-Indigenous people are willing to address except in the past tense. Yet if racialized power and privilege in the United States today are rooted in the historic and ongoing colonization of Native North America, dismantling the colonial relationships that still undergird the state is in the interest of not only indigenous nations and peoples, but all subordinated peoples of color, and quite possibly a large majority of those who identify as white Americans. Thanks.
Okay. So you said a couple of things in there that just kind of like resonated with me. And I hope you don't mind me like popping in between the sections that you're.
I would love for you to do that.
Yeah, we've been having a lot of conversations about, how Obama being president really messed with the heads of a whole lot of people, to the point of it's like this amazing thing that opened up this really ugly thing that has always been there, but has never had to vocalize how ugly it was, until that moment. Um, and it's just, I think that, one of the quotes that I put in here, and I don't know if I don't think you're reading this section. You might be, but you say, um, well, la, 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 la. The myth of colonialism is that it carried with it and applied sovereignty. The truth is that state sovereignty was claimed and constituted through colonialism. And I think that, it gets into that muddy place of like, so like even now with the mask mandates, right? you know, um, with the Supreme Court saying, okay, you can't actually do that. But then it reminds me of the Native American Removal Act, when the Supreme Court also said to Andrew Jackson, okay, no, you can't actually do that. You can't actually remove all these people from their land and march them someplace else. Is actually unconstitutional. And he was like, yeah, I'm gonna do it anyway. So it's kind of like that weird way of I don't know. It just it boggles my mind a little bit. And so I think that law is one of those things that is so, it's interesting because there are always laws that counter the laws that counter the laws.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that is part of the how cartoons, when a character is tripping and their feet just kind of keep going and going and going, they never quite fall, but their feet just kind of, that's how I feel sometimes when these laws and these things that can and cannot be done bump up against each other. It's like I'm registering it and I'm falling, but I'm not going to fall because there's this other thing that says that's okay. And then there's this other thing that says, okay, maybe it's okay if only you do it like this. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm blabbering. But yeah, no, go ahead.
It does. And I think that's a really important thing to appreciate about the law, because we tend, no matter like how oppressed people are in this society, I'm always astonished at the fact that, at the faith that people have in the legal system. And it kind of breaks your heart, right? Because, people say, well, I'm going to go to court and I'm going to tell them the truth. And, that's going to get me off. And, it very rarely does, right? It's people, we should have a system that works like that. And it's good for people to have faith in such a system, but that's not the system we have. And then people just get crushed over and over again. And I really, that's one of the things I try to talk about in here, is that we need to look beyond the remedies that are offered by the state, right? And these legal remedies are very much among those. And I think it's really important to remember, in a very early case that had to do with Indigenous people's right to land, Johnson versus McIntosh, the Supreme Court was faced with this question of, there were these two white guys who were both claiming the land, right? And one of them said, I got my title from the American Indian owner, and the other one said, I got it from, blah, 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 which ultimately came from the British Crown. And so the question was, which one had valid title, right? You can guess who won. But the reason, the reasoning behind that is what's really interesting, right? And Justice Marshall, John Marshall, who was, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a very revered jurist, and a very smart guy, right, said, this might not look quite right, but the reason that the one with title from the crown wins, basically, he didn't use these words, but is because of, we have the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery said, whichever European colonizing power gets there first what it really said was gets to negotiate with the indigenous people of the land. And he says, and he, and that was a European doctrine, not an indigenous people's law, right? And then he turns it completely upside down and he says, well, because the American Indians, because only the first European power who got there could negotiate with the Indians to buy the land, that meant the Indians couldn't sell it to whoever they wanted. And we all know that if you actually own something, you can sell it to whoever you want. Therefore, they must not have really owned it, right? Completely like crazy making logic, right? And then he says, now, this might not seem quite right, and this might look like it's a little contrary to international law and to some other things. He says, but we are the courts of the conqueror, right? I mean, he's just straight up admitting we have to come up with this convoluted craziness that says only white people can own land here, right? Because we are the courts of the conqueror. Right. And so really he's saying this is about power. It's not about law.
It's about power and it's about who won.
Exactly. And so, and that's still true today, right? We dressed it up in all this nice language, and I'm not saying that there's not it's not important to use the legal system, because sometimes we can protect people. Sometimes, we have to fight for our rights within the legal system. We have to do that to survive and to protect people who are vulnerable, but it's not going to save us, right? The courts of the conqueror are not going to abdicate conquest.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Whew. I think I'm ready for the next section.
So I was actually going to read this little section on land and indigenous people, which might be a little repetitive, but I don't think so. And I just wanted to say, in starting out, that I wanted to acknowledge, as I think it's important for us always to do, even when we're virtual, where we are, right? And we are today, you and I anyway, I don't know about all of our listeners or watchers, on land of the Muskogee Creek peoples. And, we know that it's land from which they were violently and horrifically removed. And we know that it's land that is soaked in the blood of enslaved people. We know that it's land that has seen many, many horrific, things happen, as well as many, many positive things. But I just think it's important to just think about where we are, because that helps us be grounded and helps us, really think about what's important and how to make things right in light of the very real context we're in.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I do a lot of work around the city with different organizations, and I'm actually working with 7 Stages and the Big Read, and the book that we're doing is Joy Harjo's American Sunrise. And so we go into these schools and we talk about us being on Muskogee land and what that means, and just to get these young people just some sort of idea of, there was stuff here before there was stuff here. Right. There were people here, you know what I mean? And just to acknowledge that this is the ground that we're standing on, right? And it's just it's not something that's taught. I mean, it's mentioned, but it's not taught in that way of you have a responsibility to, acknowledge, or at least, acknowledge where you are, even if you're not going to respect it, just acknowledge that that's the thing. So I appreciate you saying that. It's like the world is, it's all this connection of different things. And, I just thought it was awesome that you said that, because we just did this with kids last week who had no idea, and pulling out the names of some of the places that are definitely native words and native words and native names, and then being like, oh, I'm like, come on. I was always a precocious kid. I wanted to know the world that I lived in and what was around me. And I just want these young people, young and old, to actually connect and do the same thing. I'm sorry, kumbaya. I told you I go there sometime. So the next section.
Okay, it's the beginning of a chapter on land and indigenous peoples. And I start with a quote from Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, because a lot of us forget about the role. We think about his role in SNCC sometimes, but we forget sometimes, and I know I have forgotten until recently, how he really had an extraordinarily clear analysis of this as a settler colonial state. And he said, in order to be a successful settler colony, one must commit genocide against the traditional owners of the land. So I start out the chapter by saying, in the Anglo-American master narrative, the United States represents the culmination of Western civilization, and Western civilization in turn embodies the highest stage of human development. The narrative is embedded in a worldview that presumes its own universality, sees human history as linear and progressive, defines progress in terms of human dominion over the natural world, and constructs hierarchies of people based on their levels of development. As the origin story of the settler state, it begins with European colonizers and unfolds as a tale of their triumph over all enemies, including the wilderness. A primary theme is territorial control, for land is not merely a component of settler society, but its basic precondition. Securing its land base has been and remains integral to the United States establishment and expansion, the creation of its wealth and power, and the maintenance of its global hegemony. This is why the cry of border control has such resonance among those who see their interests aligning with those of the state. The central narrative is also, of course, about people, but only as seen through settler eyes. The primary actors are European colonizers and their descendants, particularly male settlers, in accordance with their patriarchal worldview. Indigenous peoples are problematic to this narrative. Their very existence calls into question the legitimacy of settler occupation, and thus their nations have been targeted for destruction, containment, and conceptual disappearance. As Cherokee artist Jimmy Durham put it, the settlers must consume us. There's no one to challenge their ownership except ourselves, which of course cannot be allowed. The appropriation of land and natural resources thus requires the elimination of the owners of the territory, but not in any particular way. This is a foundational premise of American history, a reality that, as Derek Bell noted about the intractability of racial subordination, quote, many will wish to deny, but none can refute. At this point, it's tempting, at least to many non-Indigenous people, to say, yes, yes, we know it was ugly, but it's all in the past and we just need to move on. Exasperated by being told don't go there when she talks about race, Korean-American comedian Margaret Cho responds, I live there. I bought a house there. We too live there, here, and we cannot deconstruct the racism that permeates American society without being willing to confront its origins and the functions it continues to serve. How the United States acquired and maintains its territorial base is rarely subjected to close scrutiny. Among non-Indigenous people, some attribute this to the belief that there's no point in feeling guilty about things we cannot change. However, if we really could not change anything, it's unlikely that the resistance would be so adamant. It is the possibility of fundamental change that makes going there scary, tempting us to simply accept colonial occupation as a given, rather than to consider the implications of decolonization. A functional analysis that begins with space, the acquisition and maintenance of territorial control, is critical to understanding and countering the strategies that have been and continue to be used to keep all those deemed other, literally and figuratively in our place. The exploitation of non-Indigenous peoples of color, forced or induced to migrate to the United States, required land, the basic precondition of settler society, and the institutionalized racism we live with today originated in the strategies used to occupy Indigenous lands. So what do you think about that, Theresa?
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. But it's. I mean, it's amazing to me. I think that you know, as we talk about those concepts of colonization and that mentality of who is a settler, who's not a settler, and you know, and bringing it into the now with all this upheaval we have about a fair elections or whatever they want to call it, right? And how that gap between, this is probably gonna sound really wrong, that gap between those people who are fighting for people who are not serving their interests, but they can't see it because they look like them. Does that make sense? And 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 I think that's what breaks my brain sometimes. It's like you're still poor. You're still, they when they talk about this big plan or this big, they're not talking about you. But because they look like you're in the club. You assume you're in the club. Um, and I mean, I would love to see some everything happening, but I think the last 2 years have kind of twisted something in our system, and I'm hoping that it twisted in the right way, so that things actually do change. I mean, I am forever hopeful that things will change and that rights will be wrong, but then I kind of wrestle between that place of hope and offense. Um, like for me to free somebody posthumously when you knew that no crime had been committed. You know what I mean? Like no crime had been committed. No, they were murdered, or the injustice was solely put onto them. But you're going to posthumously um, grant them a parole that should have never been a thing in the first place. So it's that fine line between, okay, we're woke, now we're going to acknowledge that we did a whole bunch of stuff wrong without actually acknowledging that we did a whole bunch of stuff wrong. Is that, and then I feel like I'm being too jaded, but then I'm like, wait, I think part of the okey doke is that we start feeling like we're asking too much or we wanting too much, when it's like, no, we actually just want what's right. So yeah, so I wrestle with the in-betweens of that, the being hopeful and then also outraged and offended. And it's kind of like a vacillation between that. It's like it's been windshield wiper existence over here forever, but it's like the windshield wipers kicked into high gear in 2020, and I don't think they can stop now. I think it's got to keep going forward. I think the minute we stop pushing for change is when we all drown.
One of the things.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you just reminded me that I'm co-teaching a class now with my colleague Akinyele Umoja from Africana Studies on reparations, and so we've been, thinking and reading and talking a lot about reparations in that class, and in that space we encounter all the dynamics that you just talked about, right? Like, is that good to get somebody posthumously exonerated or whatever? Is that bad? I mean, it's not bad, but like, is it a victory, or is it just reinforcing sort of the legitimacy of the status quo? And I've come to the conclusion that reparations can serve both purposes, right? They can actually be restorative of people's well-being, but they can also legitimize injustices and an unjust system. And therefore, sort of the touchstones that I use in thinking about these questions are dignity, power, and truth. And whether a measure or the struggle for something enhances human dignity in some form, right? The dignity of the people involved and the people who have been harmed, whether it empowers them or is ceding power. Like, we can ask, like, if we just go and ask Congress for, please pass this bill, right? We're ceding our power to them, right? On the other hand, struggling to get a particular kind of legislation passed can be very empowering. And so I think it can go either way. And then I think underlying it all, we always have to be willing and committed to making sure that the truth comes out, right? Even if it's truths that are not especially convenient.
Yeah. Sometimes the truth hurts in different ways. And I mean, I agree with all that. I think that it's and this might be a jump all over everybody's everything, but like to hear people who don't want to be vaccinated or who don't want to wear masks, who are not people of color, compare themselves to, Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. It's just it's that sort of offense. I think that like your struggle, like comparing wearing a mask, for instance, to what happened in Germany, the Holocaust. It's like how are you even putting those things two things together, first of all, and how are they coming out of your mouth and you not being set on fire immediately? I'm just sorry. Those are the views of Theresa Davis, not the views of the ArtsXchange. But,
Yeah.
but how is the hypocrisy not like choking you right now?
Right. And I think, part of that hypocrisy is, especially with the, sort of the use of, Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King or whatever, that's cultural appropriation, right? That's taking, the resistance of African-American communities over generations and generations and appropriating it for such a different end. And that's really, really problematic, right? And that kind of gets me to one of the other things points that I try to make in this book is that equality and equal treatment and assimilationism is not going to save us, right? And that's part of what they're doing there when they try to do stuff like that, right? Just to say we're all part of the same culture, or we all just need to act like Americans, right? And forcing those of us who want to be accepted and not discriminated against to give up our histories and our cultures and our understandings of ourselves as peoples. And that's, sort of, to me, that's what decolonization is about, right? Is being able to express ourselves as who we really are, and not being forced to identify with the dominant society in order to not be killed or discriminated against or otherwise oppressed.
Wow. Yeah. Huh. Were you ever on a debate team?
No, I went to an international school in Japan. We never even heard of a debate team.
No. I was on a debate team, and I would often choose the side of something that I didn't believe. Like it's like if it was about something I believed in, I would take the I don't believe in this approach and try to come up with all the ridiculousness that I can think of to dispute this thing that I actually believe in. And so, the last 2 years I've been kind of like, oh my God, people actually say this stuff that I thought was completely ridiculous and was just trying to, upset people. And like there are people who actually believe this, and they're not playing in a class. They're not acting. They're serious. So I think that that's pretty scary. And I think that so do you think that well, this is I know you don't, but believe that maybe somewhere in our future, like a cosmic light bulb will go off, and something will happen. We're getting bombed by something ridiculous. Take care of that. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of want a cosmic light bulb to go off, and people all of a sudden get it, but I don't think that's going to happen. It's like we're all living Truman Show.
Yeah. No, it's true. And I feel like, one of the reasons this lens of settler colonialism has made a lot of sense to me is that it explains to me a lot of the reaction that we're getting from, predominantly white folks, not predominantly all white folks, right? But the reaction of people who feel like something they're entitled to is being taken away from them. And if you think about it as sort of that narrative of settler prerogative, right? We came here, we found this vacant land, and we, took it and made it productive. Completely ignoring the fact, right, that it was enslaved African as well as indigenous labor that made it so productive, right? But it's that narrative that has come down to justify the occupation and the exploitation of the resources and the people that has made this country so rich and powerful. It's that notion that there's, that's fulfilling some bigger, God ordained purpose and making the world a better place, and that, this is part of their identity. They've been told so often that this is their identity, right? This is who you are, and this is what you deserve. That then, when it starts to unravel out from under them, it messes up their whole framework. Apparently, right? I mean, I don't really know, but that's what it looks like. Is that their world is coming apart at the seams, and that's part of why I also think that, like, we can't just, like, they're not just gonna get over it, right? It's like we have to think about how to sort of demonstrate that this is what they've been told, but it's not true, and it's not necessarily in their best interest, given that it's not true, right? And that's a hard one. I don't know what the answer there is. Pretty sure it's not you and me who's going to be able to do that, but
right. All right, I'm ready for your last section.
Okay. And this is from the conclusion. So earlier in the book, I quoted something from Robert Cover, who is a law professor, who says, the position that only the state creates law confuses the status of interpretation with the status of political domination. Legal meaning is a challenging enrichment of social life, a potential restraint on arbitrary power and violence. We ought to stop circumscribing the nomos. We ought to invite new worlds. In my conclusion, I say, our stories, the narratives of our past and present, allow us to envision and build our futures. A realistic narrative about contemporary manifestations of racism must begin by acknowledging that in the United States today, we're defined by colonial relations. Unlike their brethren who colonized much of Africa and Asia, the Anglo-American, quote, founding fathers, did not come to extract profit from the land, labor, and natural resources of their colonies and then return home. Instead, they came to stay. This meant occupying the land and doing their best to disappear the peoples indigenous to that land. It meant making the land profitable by importing labor, voluntary and involuntary, and establishing structures for controlling that labor. These colonizers came with a presumption of their own sovereign prerogative, not to join someone else's society, but to establish a state over which they exercised complete control. They assert to this day the right to determine who will be permitted to enter or remain within their claimed boundaries, who will be accorded particular civil or political rights, and the extent to which settler privilege will be promoted and protected by the state. These prerogatives are manifest through a racial hierarchy that pervades all aspects of life in the United States, one that is enshrined in its legal system and is intended to ensure that each person remains in their place, literally and figuratively. Racialized injustice continues to shape the lives and limit the potential of each generation of children in this country. The United States is neither post-racial nor post-colonial, and a revised narrative will not change these realities. However, by understanding the functions served by the policies and practices of the settler colonial state, we can more creatively envision remedial measures and assess their ability to empower our communities. Rather than engaging in what amount to moral appeals to a legal system that has facilitated genocide, slavery, and racialized subjugation, we can expose its lack of moral authority and consider ways in which law can further decolonization. We can actively and collectively engage in the construction of the law, and by extension, in the creation of social, political, economic, educational, and cultural institutions that meet the needs of our communities. As Robert Cover urged, we can stop circumscribing the nomos and invite new worlds. We're supported in this effort by fundamental principles of international law. International law does not provide us with any quick fixes, but its emphasis on human dignity affirms that we cannot be free within social structures that crush the human spirit. International law clearly mandates decolonization, and we cannot pretend that this does not apply to settler colonial states. Our first and foundational responsibility is to support Indigenous struggles for self-determination, because as long as Indigenous peoples are colonized in the United States, the rest of us are complicit in the occupation. To the extent we refuse to function as colonizers, we'll be able to promote the right of all peoples to self-determination. It's a right that can be exercised in an infinite variety of ways, from gatherings where members of a community identify their needs and priorities, to the assertion of local control of policing, education, or healthcare services, to the reorganizing of economically self-sufficient and politically independent nations. The crux, as I see it, is whether any given action empowers communities and promotes decolonization, or further entrenches extant relationships of domination and subordination. We take inspiration from those who came before us, whose struggles for survival allowed us to be here today. When we challenge the status quo, we can never be certain of victory, but we know that as we implement our collective understandings of what human societies can be, we are engaging in processes of decolonization. We do not require anyone's permission to live with dignity or to exercise our right to self-determination. Those who build community-controlled institutions create space for future generations to thrive. Those who take to the streets or otherwise physically challenge the prevailing order demonstrate the futility of the laws intended to keep colonized peoples perpetually subordinated. The late Derek Bell reminded us that by refusing to allow the guns and dogs of the state to intimidate them into inaction, those who step out to defend the people allow us to see our own potential. He encouraged us to, quote, stand in the place where persons of courage have always stood, uncertain of victory but unafraid of defeat, remembering what, quote, the old black farmer who had left its field to march from Selma to Montgomery said when asked whether they would win. We won when we started.
Whew. Yes, I have, I have hope. I have hope. I have hope. So I wanted to ask you about some of the current things that are happening. Two things in particular, and what are your views on these things? So every couple of years or decades or something in the world happens. The book banning conversation comes up again. So I was an educator for over 30 years in the classroom, and when I started teaching sixth and seventh grade middle school, I chose my book list primarily from the Burned Banned book list, right? So they read a lot of those books that were being banned, and I explained, and then afterwards, I had them tell me why they were banned. But we always started off with The Cat in the Hat, which was a banned book, which was a book that they asked him to write, right? These are the words that we want used, but like the themes that are in The Cat in the Hat are pretty. I mean, stranger danger went out the window. We just letting strangers in the house. We destroying property. We lying to our parents. It's a lot of things in there. So I got it on a level. But so what do you think about this new surge to ban books and I've always been of the thing, you tell people they can't do something, they're going to do it more. So like 3 of the books that they're trying to ban are like the bestsellers now. These books are like 1,000,000 years old. So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with you that I don't think they're going to succeed in keeping these ideas from people, but it demonstrates that real history is what they're afraid of, right? And real knowledge about other people and other communities. It demonstrates that they're determined to try to keep us in this colorblind assimilationist mold, don't think outside of this box, right? Even though we know that this box has been used to oppress us forever. And it's empowering in that sense for us, right? It says, ooh, we've been doing something right, to bring this history out. But it also reminds me of, the attempts to keep enslaved people from learning how to read. Like, to me, this is just the latest extension of that. It's like, well, if we keep these people illiterate, they won't be able to find out certain things that will empower them and allow them or encourage them to rise up. And now that, they can't really say that anymore, although they kind of try with the way they fund the school system. But, so now it's like, okay, fine, you can read, but you're not going to read this, right? Here, read all this other trash. Or it might not be trash, but, whatever things that support the views we want you to have. So to me, it's just an extension of that same mentality. And I don't think it's going to work any better than the ban on literacy worked.
Yeah. And it's like a book that, Mouse is like what, the number 3 book sold right now in the world, just because, like, we live in a country, I think, where if you're told specifically not to do a thing, I know me as a child growing up, my parents learned to phrase things very differently. It's like, if you tell me I can't do something, I'm totally going to do that thing. But and then I know so many friends of mine who were preachers' kids, right, who were told they couldn't do a plethora of things, and like that was their list, their goal of things to do. So yeah, I don't think it's going to work, and I've said to my children, it's like, I live for my book to be banned one day. That would be like, you've made it,
right?
You're there. So like, I think that's a pop collar moment, where like, they don't want people to read me, and you get to do the celebratory dance of yourself. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, what do you think about the potential Black women who are on the short list to become part of the Supreme Court justices?
Wow, that's a really good question, but you really had to give me warning on that one. I cannot say that I have researched them properly enough to really be able to say anything intelligent.
Just the idea of it. I mean, like, Obama broke their brains, and Kamala kind of messed with their heads. But I think that this is going to do something different. Like, I already heard one, was it a congressman or someone saying that if a Black woman took this job, she would be benefiting from affirmative action. And that is, I was like, wait, what? I'm sorry. Again, that would be one of those crazy things I would say when I was debating something I believed in, but like, I mean, what do you think? How do you think the world will react, or the United States will react to having a Black woman on the Supreme Court?
I'm a little worried that it's going to be like Obama, right? Like, there'll be a lot of rejoicing, and yet not a lot of actual change that comes from it. And that's not to say it's a bad thing at all. It's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's good for our children and grandchildren to see that. It's good for it to be the reality. But the notion that after how many years, right, a Black woman gets on the court is affirmative action is just like, that's just nuts. Right? But also, I feel a little resentful that it's coming right now, because, they have the clear majority, right? And I sort of feel like, oh, once we've got this thing sewn up, then we'll let y'all people of color in. And, I'm a little touchy about that at the moment.
Yeah.
But
yeah, same. I think that it is a thing that could do a lot of mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. But I always, and I think this is part of what a main thing that bothers me about law is, like, you're supposed to be in a community of your peers. Like, when you're judged, you're supposed to be judged by, the jury is community of your peers. But when no one looks like you, and when no one has experienced some of the things that you've experienced, that you don't have a peer there, so I feel like this would be that idea of, okay, someone who looks like me, who may have experienced some of the things that I've experienced, who definitely knows what it is to walk in the world as a person of color. That makes me feel more represented, even if it might just be this kind of show of representation, but I feel like, okay, I've been invited to the party a little bit, so I'm hopeful that it will be this amazing thing that happens. I'm hopeful in a lot of things. Like I said, I always have hope. I think when you stop having hope and you stop believing that change can happen, like I said before, is when we start drowning. And I'm completely against drowning. I do not suggested. So I want to thank you for sharing some time with me today and with our audience out there in the world of Facebook, and in YouTube Live. And it's a beautiful day outside. And I think the wonderful thing about the way we do this particular program is that it will be up and accessible to people forever. It's on the internet, so people can come and check it in and check out whenever they want to. But I want to thank you so much, Natsu, for joining me today. Thank you for your words of wisdom. Can you tell people where they can find the book and anything that you have coming up that people might be able to show up to? Like, is there an online talk or anything like that that's happening? Let us know what's going on.
I don't think there are any scheduled right now. I just finished several. But the book's available from NYU Press and also on Amazon, right? Which, for better or worse, is out there. And hopefully at your library. So that's what I would say is try to get your library to get it.
Yeah. I always do that, and I will call my library and be like, hey, do you have? That's what a lot of my friends, when my book came out, a lot of my friends, called up library. So I always, whenever I go to a city, I go to a library and see if my book's there. And when it's there, I was like, again, I've won. One of the things that I told every child that I've ever taught is like, if you truly want to live forever, write a book. Become something that can be that people will have access to, after you're gone. But yes, I will do that. Your book will be in my library soon. Well, I want to
thank you. And I just wanted to say thank you for all the work that you're doing, because I think that it's really amazing and powerful work. I think the attacks on so-called critical race theory and race scholarship, illustrates the power of words, right? How important words are. And also, I think that the work y'all are doing at the ArtsXchange is really a great example of what I was talking about, of establishing community-controlled institutions, right? Those are the spaces in which we can be liberated, and I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. We appreciate you. Thank you so much. For those of you out there in the world listening, I have just finished talking with Professor Natsu Taylor Saito, and we have things happening at the ArtsXchange. So if you happen to be in the way, we're not having like a whole lot of in-person gatherings yet. We're hoping to open full on in person in April. But if you happen to be around East Point, the ArtsXchange does have a new gallery show coming up, and it is called The Aboriginal Museum, a revelation of true identity, and it will be up in our gallery on February 11th through March 7th. There will be an opening reception on the 11th. There will be an artist talk on the 19th, and I am hoping to do a virtual practice writing workshop with some of the images. And basically that's when you write a poem or a short story or anything from the image, and you let the image inform what you are writing. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Professor Saito, and we will see you soon, hopefully in person. Until then, virtual hugs, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you all.